here for the live podcast recording of A Shared Gaze. And we are lucky enough to have Alayo Akinkugbe with us, curator behind the podcast, the Instagram page, Black History Award, and the exhibition that brought Words of Mine with you. She will be in conversation with John-Baptiste Oduor, editor and writer, with Anya Paintsil, artist whose work you can find at the first floor and lower ground floor of the exhibition, and Chantel Akworkor Thompson, director of La Foundation. Thank you again for being here, and without any further ado, I'll leave it to you, Alayo.
Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Today, we're going to be discussing the position of Black figuration today, and especially over the past 4 years. Figurative work by Black artists has had increased interest in recent years. There's been a proliferation of this type of work in auction houses and commercial galleries, and more recently in institutions. And it feels slightly like the art world's reaction to the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, in my opinion. Figuration is the most obvious way for any gallery or institution to, performatively or not, show some kind of allyship, because a work of art depicting a Black person generally signals that it was made by a Black artist. More broadly speaking, there's been a sort of Black cultural renaissance in theatre, food and fashion, etc. So I want to start by asking everyone, did your careers or the opportunities available to you change after the resurgence of BLM in 2020? And Chantel, perhaps you can start.
Yeah, sure. Welcome, everyone. So I think it's quite an interesting one for me in terms of I was in a different place in my life. I wasn't actually in the UK during that time. I was in the Seychelles, which was quite distant. And I went there with a teaching job, but I went with the intention of being in a space that was stiller and quieter so I could really plan how I was going to move into the art world and be able to carve, you know, the kind of space in the industry that I felt was most aligned with my vision. So there I started to, you know, carve out how I wanted people to engage in the art world. And I went to Ghana, which is also home for me. And it was there at the end of 2020 where I started to see this resurgence that we're seeing, you know, the start of that. And since then, you know, we've seen what we've seen. I moved to Ghana in 2021. And initially, the first job I took was nothing to do with figurative art. So I wasn't engaged in, you know, this space, but I was engaged in the art world and in more of an academic space. But then some months later, I met Alote, who is the studio manager at the Boafos studio space. And I just started hanging out with these guys. And within some time, I started working with them and then became very much more engaged with figurative art. So in terms of like whether 2020 changed my career, I feel like I was already moving in that way. Has it given me some of the opportunities I've had now? I mean, I'm sure maybe, but I just wouldn't really be able to like map it out exactly. And
it wasn't
say,
like a marked shift.
Yeah.
And what about for you, Anya?
For me, it's quite different, but also I wasn't working in the way that I am now, pre-2020. I was at university, I was in my last year, and I was graduating into COVID, basically. But I'd gone to university without having studied fine art at A-level or foundation, and I'd worked full-time since I was 16. And when I was about 24, I was just kind of like, I'm bored, so I want to go to art school and do something I like. And I never had the goal of being a professional artist in mind. And if I did in some way, I was very kind of African art, Black art motivated with a Black audience in mind. Like I'd never really had aspirations of kind of transcending the mainstream. Like I was really critiqued in uni by white lecturers who would say they didn't understand a lot of the references in my work or the visual language of my work, and I'd just kind of be like, I would say, well, it's not for you, like I didn't make it for you, and then I'd get like a third or a 2-2, and then I started working with a gallery in London who primarily represents African artists, Ed Cross, in my second year of university. So I was selling work at that time. I think for me, market change is very obviously is a massive thing with the boom of black figuration and pricing. But I suppose it hasn't changed how I work. But I think one thing that I was very kind of critical of, I'm still early career, but in 2020 I was getting a lot of museum interest, and I was just kind of like, I'm in uni, like this is a bit performative, like maybe because they want to look like they're buying black artists' work, and obviously because I was at university and I was super emerging, my work was really cheap, so I thought of it as, is this some sort of gesture that, and particularly because I'm Welsh, a lot of Welsh institutions who hadn't shown interest in me before wanted to collect my work. But then when I'd speak with these institutions and I'd go to meetings with them, I'd find them full of people from diverse backgrounds, people of colour, often clustered around like the middle of institutions when they're headed by white people, but they were given opportunities based off 2020 to collect the work that they like and make reasons for work to be in collections. And I think there's every institution that I've basically worked with, there's somebody in that institution who is fighting for change and to have the work reflect the people they want to collect, the people who work there, the people in the UK. And I think it's, I suppose sometimes framed as a kind of jump, like we need to do this, we need to show we care about this, but there's institutions are not faceless bodies, they're made up of hundreds of people who have disparate and different things that they care about. So I think maybe Instagram interest, I think a lot of people were sharing my work in a way that was like performative, and people were sending me like weird messages, and I feel like I was included in lots of articles which were like almost sympathy based, that felt like icky. But my career's changed totally. I think that's because I was at uni, but I'm not sure, because I had no career before, I'm not sure how I can put that down to pre or post 2020. Mm-hmm. But yeah.
Because it was sort of beginning alongside.
It was beginning alongside it, and then obviously, I suppose if there was different market trends, then it would have been different, and those market trends can be very much put down to a lot of people wanting to have visibly black made art in their collections, I guess. So.
And what about you, John-Baptiste? Did you feel like there was a shift?
I think there was a shift in terms of like my interest as a critic and writer and the kind of problems that I started. Like, so I guess like the first wave of BLM thought there was a kind of like a kind of upsurge of kind of like kind of lots of like black visual kind of representation, and then that brought with it a lot of discussions about kind of co-option and authenticity and who are the authentic representatives of this particular artwork or this particular political movement. And then by the time we got to 2020, it felt, to me at least, that this was a kind of like these same problems from a decade ago had kind of come back. And then in terms of my writing, like one of the things that I found myself becoming really interested in was like artists that kind of incorporate this kind of anxiety about representation and authenticity into their own work, and don't just do the kind of thing of, oh, I'm clearly a black artist representing black life, whatever that is, but instead I see that in the world in which images are kind of sold, there's a particular kind of like social significance attached to black artists already, and I'm trying to respond to that in a way which is like playful and ironic. So I think it might have been 2020 or 2021, I'd gone to see the show by this British Ghanaian artist, Lynette Yedamboyake, and like I think she's like a very interesting artist, but like what was interesting to me at that moment was how, to me, her work seemed kind of obsessed with these anxieties about pinning down their figures and showing them in a particular social space which would be recognizable to other people. And then especially the kind of contrast in like her like very early work which seemed to me to be like the figures seemed to be kind of like quite clearly kind of situated in a, not clearly, but at least you could interpret them as being situated within a kind of African context. But then in the later work, they just kind of exist in this world which can't be situated at all sociologically. And then I guess after 2020, I became like really increasingly like interested in why it was that so many Black artists were responding to or trying to avoid producing work which was authentic or conformed to some kind of expectation. And I guess I can still quite interested in like whether that's even a possible thing to do within whilst you're working in kind of figuration as well, because obviously the image has to be kind of an image of something, and that itself is something which is kind of it's kind of hard to kind of play that game without conforming to the expectation of the viewer. So I guess what I want to say is like from 2020 I became interested in that set of problems, and I think that's kind of still kind of carried me forward.
And in your articles of frieze, you wrote about Black figuration and Black figures in paintings, and often being referred to in art writing as Black bodies, which sort of takes away, in my opinion, their humanity and their agency, because a body kind of sounds like a non-living person.
Yeah.
And so why do you think that this kind of language is so commonplace with regards to writing about figurative work by Black artists specifically?
It's funny because it's like, it's one of those, I mean, like a kind of charitable read is like, I guess this language is all about like helping people to understand like harm and violence and how that's a thing that's like experienced, that like Black people experience. It kind of immediately put the viewer in the position of having to engage with the work kind of empathetically. We're witnessing some kind of object in front of us that we should care about, or like care about in a kind of like a kind of like affectionate way. And I think that obviously is like a way that you can relate to like an artwork, but it's not like the only way. And then the obsession, the talk of like bodies kind of pushed the interpretation in that direction in a way that like kind of closed off other things, bodies and suffering and that stuff. It kind of stops us from enjoying or thinking about art as something which is like, I know, like more kind of playful and ironic. It's supposed to be kind of annoying and provocative, but then the whole bodies talk just stops us from even getting that interview. Yeah, that kind of stuff kind of irks me a bit.
Do either of you have anything to say about that? The use of that word?
For me, I guess, I think there's a very set idea and I suppose theme that runs across a lot of Black figuration in terms of both visual language and also colour, particularly use of colour. Like, it is a Kerry James Marshall effect, but I think it can also speak to fetishism a lot, or self-fetishism that we see in things like the modelling world as well. South Sudanese people, like very black skin being used as a aesthetic device when the artists, even though they're Black, then maybe mixed race, they may have lighter skin. I think I see that a lot, and I see that as something I feel weird about, that I suppose it's a form of colorism, but representation in a way that's not really representation. It's not representation in the sense they're a person with a voice. I think people are used for their aesthetics quite a lot, and that is not something that I suppose exists in the same way in white figuration or any figuration, that it's not, you don't see a painting of a white person and it's all about the hue of their skin tone, and it's very odd to me that that's not seen, I suppose, as can be being problematic in some ways, I guess, particularly if the artist is lighter skinned, or as in a light skinned Black person or a mixed race person. I think it's something that runs across a lot of Black figuration.
And Chantel, do you think that the increase in collectors buying into the African market, and perhaps figurative art more specifically, has an eventual impact on the kind of work that appears in museum exhibitions? That sort of links to what I was saying in terms of like different gazes having different interpretations. But I know that we also spoke about how certain kinds of collectors buying into the African art market is changing the way that, is affecting what we begin to see in museums and in academia even as well.
I mean, I think it definitely affects what's being produced, especially within Ghana. So one of the services that we offer at the foundation I have in Ghana, Foundation for the Arts, is portfolio reviews to emerging and early career artists. And it was interesting having the dialogues with them about their work and, why they're doing the work that they're doing. And there's this idea that they need to follow the market trends. So it's like, okay, we're going to do that because that's what is selling. So with the increasing number of collectors buying into figurative portraiture work and following what's happening in the auction, you get artists who may have had a totally different practice before, now coming into, this space of where there's these very bright and lucid kind of backgrounds with no context, these very these beautiful figures and all these slight differentiations in terms of how the skin is rendered. You get moments where you see an artwork and then you're like, oh, no, I've seen that before, because they use exactly the same reference model. And I think, it's a different landscape, a different infrastructure, and people are using it for different reasons. So the artwork is a commodity. People are creating a product to then go on and sell. But then in terms of, your question around what we're now seeing in institutions and museums, definitely I think that there's a lot more figurative portraiture in museums. There's a lot more work in museums that isn't as mature as it used to be. If we think about the history of collections and artists who were collecting. So even Anya, you were talking about being contacted by institutions who wanted to collect your work, and you're in university and you don't have a long body, of work, a long practice. And that's not normal kind of practice for museums. I can understand museums wanting to document this moment in time, because we can't deny the fact that it's had such a huge impact on art, on the art world, who consumes art, who engages with art. It really has. And I wouldn't want to kind of discredit the benefits that it has given to a lot of people, and the opportunities and the access, and the fact that you can go to Brooklyn Museum and have the collection that Swiss Beats and Alicia Keys have in that space, and therefore the people that would come into that space who wouldn't historically go into that space, who decides when and where and how, and just because historically it's been done one way, why shouldn't it change? So I think, sometimes motivation might not also always be the one that would most be aligned with, but it's how you take advantage of those opportunities for the better.
And John-Baptiste, do you think that this proliferation of figurative work by Black artists has had an overall negative or positive impact? I know that's a big question, but in the art world and also for Black artists.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess my sense, I did a tiny bit of data digging. My sense is that it's obviously there was a bump in 2020, but the increase in interest in kind of the work of Black artists generally, and figurative artists in particular, has been steady, and upwardly increasing since the 80s. And part of that is because of the kind of institutional critique that was happening in the art world in the 70s and 80s, and the kind of discussions that you had with artists who were coming of age in the 60s, who felt themselves to be kind of rejected and not kind of kind of by kind of blue chip galleries. And I think that the increase has kind of just been steady. And I think part of the there's a kind of tendency sometimes to think that a growing interest in kind of the work of Black artists is just a kind of a one-off fad, when in reality it's like just a product of like artists who've been around for like a very long time, who've like been critiquing institutions from the inside for like quite a while. I think maybe this, like what we're seeing in 2020 is like a bit of an overcorrection, but then I think that overcorrection should be seen in the context of like the kind of dismissiveness of like the political aspects of kind of black artists' work in earlier generations, and in the wash it kind of comes out as fine maybe.
Do either of you have something to say about that?
Just responding to that, yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. Like, I think obviously 2020 was a massive sea change in the world, but if we discuss black figuration and black art only through that lens, then we forget all of the black artists who've, I suppose, come before us and beat down the path for decades. And I suppose thinking of it that way, it seems like we've just been waiting in the wings for like white people to say, yeah, you can come in now, but not the fact that people have been fighting for their work to be included in institutions, their own work and the work of other black artists to be included in institutions for decades. So, yeah, I suppose that should always be part of the conversation, really. And I hadn't really thought about it in this context until you said.
Chantel, you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I guess there's positive and negatives to it, but I would talk on the positives. This moment is one of them. You know, we've got to remember that this may have not been something that would have been possible before. So, yes, there are definitely some disadvantages, and I've written about those and I've spoken about those. But I think, you know, it's important to highlight, you know, some of those positive things. And as I said, I feel like the way that the communities engaged in this artwork have galvanized this moment and turned it into a movement is what's most
that's sort of what I wanted to ask you about next, because we spoke just earlier about how I guess this style of art that's around us has been seen very much as a trend, and you were talking about how you feel that the artists who are based in Accra, so Amako Adjei and others, have sort of regained control over their narrative or tried to turn it into a movement as opposed to like some sort of trend. Could you sort of expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, even the fact that Adjei is doing as well as he is because of that. You know, the moment could have stopped with Amwako, what we call the Amwako boom. That could have been the moment, and that was it. But, you know, he was studying in Vienna, living in Vienna, but he moved back to Ghana, that's home, and he very much invested his time in being able to start, you know, planting those seeds of the infrastructure and the ecosystem that we're currently seeing blooming even more. So like the residency space just opened at the end of 2022, but that's just, I guess, a next or further iteration of what he'd already started with his like incubator space. And then we have like in Kumasi, you've got Black Star Lines. So, you know, people like Ibrahim Mahama, who's over in Tamale, and Nia Bodai, and what he's been able to do for photography in Tamale and across Ghana. You know, you just got all these like collectives of individuals and groups of people working together, but then also there's like this bigger ecosystem, and pretty much every single arts institution in Ghana is involved and engaged in, you know, programming and activations for that. And that's what's just so special about the art scene in Ghana. It is the community. It is the people. It's people using the resources around them, sharing those resources and being able to create something that is for them. And even if they are, you know, having opportunities abroad, that's in order to bring back home, in order to keep building that infrastructure. So whether it's like a physical building or whether it's just the knowledge that they gain from the industry, you know, I think that Ghana's success is that everyone got together and worked together to build together the infrastructure and the ecosystem that works for them.
Anya, as an artist based in the UK, would you say that there's a similar sense of community or less so?
I don't know. I don't really like going out or meeting people. I'm a kind of somebody who likes to be left alone. I think there is. I see lots of people hanging out, and I do get invited to lots of things. But also, I'm autistic, so I don't do well with networking and stuff like this, and I like to be left alone most of the time. I would like to be involved in community building, however, I don't do it. So yeah, I can't speak on it. I've lived in London for a year now. Before I was up in Wales, where I'm from. So there's a very London-based community, but in Wales there's not much going on.
Same.
So yeah.
And there's a final question that I want to ask Anya. This is sort of an aside, and I should have brought it up earlier when we were talking about the body. But in your work, you include hair, synthetic hair, your own hair of your friends and family. And we've spoken many times about the fact that the hair sort of takes on a sanctity. Everybody knows that it can't be touched when it's attached to the artwork. And in your own life, obviously, as I'm sure most Black people can testify to, you'll have experiences of people touching your hair without your permission. So do you think that the inclusion of human and synthetic hair in your work affects the way that viewers approach it?
Yes, I think there's always been very kind of different marked responses between my use of synthetic hair. So I use braiding hair, which I make in Senegalese twists or box braids, and sew them to the work. But then I also, for a period of about 3 years, I'd shave my head every 6 months or so and put it all into artwork, and I have a bit of a stall left. And also, my little brother lives with me, and for some reason, every year he decides he wants locks and then makes me take them out, so he loses half his hair. So I have a store of his hair. So the use of hair in my work wasn't initially kind of personal, or it was really intuitive, because my work is primarily, at that time, was made using latch hooking, which is a technique where you use something similar to a crochet hook with a little latch on it, which you'd use in an Afro hairstyle called crochet braids. But you weave it through rug making canvas, you pull it, you make the same knot. And I was like, hey, I'm doing the same thing on my head that I am on this rug that my grandma's taught me how to make. I'm going to put hair on it. So it seemed really natural and intuitive, and it was people's responses that made me, I suppose, question it. Because when I wasn't a professional artist and I was like a weird person living in North Wales making rugs made of hair, people were very disgusted. But then, and I don't know, you can have really visceral responses to human hair depending on context. Because if you're buying it in a shop to make to get new extensions for your birthday, or if you see it in a public drain at the swimming pool, you're not going to have the same response. So I suppose once it was placed in a gallery context, it had this thing ooh, it's a material, it's human hair, it's clever. But I'd been doing it for 10 years, and everyone was like, you're just really weird. But then I suppose it then took on a context which I didn't expect, which I really didn't actually like, that I found people had a lot more respect for the fragility and autonomy of my hair when it was on a piece of work as opposed to when it was on my body. I had an experience with a curator. Me and her were handling this massive work that I'd made in 2021. It was about 11 foot wide, and it had a lot of human hair in it, and she was being incredibly precious with it, and then touching it with gloves, and then she was 10 minutes later, she started feeling my hair and was like, is this a weave? And I was just kind of are you kind of serious? My perspective as an artist, that the politics of black hair is literally embroidered into my work, but the work then has more respect than me as a human. It's something that's, I think, can be applied to a lot of black figuration in general, that people depicted in black art aren't seen as real humans. They're not seen as visual depictions of humans. They are aesthetic devices only. My hair is an aesthetic device as opposed to being part of my head. I don't know, it's an odd one. I think it's difficult for me to I've like dialed my use of human hair back in my work over like the past year because of experiences. I could make a clever point about like, oh yeah, like it has all of this respect and I've done it on purpose, but it's just something that actually just annoys me, and I don't think I want my hair going to some, because it's a part of my body, I've grown it myself, and then it's going to some rich, rude person to put it in their cellar. And it's just kind of like, well, I don't really want you to have it. So I think it becomes complicated when people buy your work. The context is ever changing. It's gone from like really minging and weird to clever. But yeah, I suppose.
Thank you for giving us the insight into that. I know we've spoken about that before, even on the podcast, but it's such an interesting and important point as well.
I think my relationship changes with it constantly, and I get more annoyed by it all the time. But also, human hair is great to work with in the way that I work with. So if I use synthetic hair, it's much more irritating I'm very kind of, I suppose, materials-minded, and my practice is very tactile, and it involves a lot of hand making. And as a material, human hair is great, but it's made my work more annoying to blend things more with synthetic hair as well, because it's harder, but then it's just kind of like, I don't want you to have it. So it's weird.
And so my final question, and just to kind of contextualize, I went to an exhibition in 2021 of Yinka Shonibara's work at Stephen Friedman Gallery, and he was questioning whether the moment that we were in, this is 1 year post the murder of George Floyd, whether it was kind of like a fad, a passing sort of moment. So I wanted to ask whether you guys think that Black figuration is sort of like a passing trend. We spoke about the Black arts movement earlier in the 80s, and there's also examples like the Harlem Renaissance in the early 20th century. And yeah, so I wondered whether you guys think it's a passing trend, or if you think it's something that will endure. I mean, obviously figuration has been around throughout art history, but do you think that this moment is sort of seeing its end? That's for all of you.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I know there were curators doing predictions about what's going to be the next trends for Black art in particular, and there was black abstraction, and there were galleries that suddenly were changing the kind of exhibitions they were doing to include more abstraction, but you're still seeing the figurative portraiture here. And I think that it will take time before, I guess, there's another trend, or whatever we want to call it, but I feel like figurative portraiture is always going to be part of the canon. Not every single artist who's sold in this time period is going to continue to sell for 5-10 years, but there'll be a lot who will. And I think that for all artists in general, how they're able to innovate within their particular practice, their particular medium, is what's going to decide how long they're relevant for.
Yeah, God, I don't know. I guess there's even work of it a decade ago, which when I'd first seen, I'd found incredibly kind of moving, or kind of able to kind of respond to a particular kind of moment. But once that moment's over, the thing then feels kind of dead. And I think that should be fine. I think I don't know, I think maybe kind of as art consumers, we should be fine with the idea of works being quite ephemeral and responding to particular moments and being kind of intelligible and kind of in that moment. And once that moment is over, then obviously what makes a particular thing interesting will then also kind of disappear as well.
I find it annoying. Not I don't know. I think this measuring of moments, of artists' career by moments and market success and market trends, and it's all effectively what people have decided that they care about, and it really takes away the agency and the creativity of the artist. Artists aren't people who just you're not H&M, you're not getting the new collection in because the art market whatevers have decided they don't like paintings anymore, so now you're in sculpture. They don't like textiles anymore, so now you need to make ceramics. It's people make art because they love making art a lot of the time, and they love what they do and they're interested in what they do. So if everybody in the world suddenly hated textiles, that wouldn't mean for me that I'm not going to make textiles anymore. I'll just go and work in a cafe and make the textiles I want to work. It's really sad to think about art in such an inauthentic way that is removed from the artist and which is entirely about trends. It's sad that people think about their practices needing to expand and change in a way that is entirely dictated by making money as opposed to what they want to do.
But then also there's the flip side. Some people don't have the privilege to make art for art's sake.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'm from a very working class background. I grew up in the UK, so there's that privilege of that, but I'd worked full-time since I was 16 and did not have parents who supported me financially.
I mean, this wasn't a comment on you, I'm just saying, I was thinking of more like a global perspective on it. So for myself, working within Ghana, also like spending a lot of time in the US and the UK with artists, there's always different conversations that you're having with artists in terms of like entry points, where they're going, aspirations, and sometimes this is dictated by their particular, their situation, the infrastructure in which they live in. We're using this term like black art, black figuration, and we're kind of, in doing that, we're limiting who we all are as individuals and our communities, which are like vast and varying. And like, it's beautiful that we can come together under this umbrella, but we can't forget, like, we're not a monolith, because some people don't actually realize the differences. I've spent time working within this D&I space, a diversity and inclusion space, and anti-racist space within the UK, and working a lot with white individuals in really big, major, like, cultural institutions that set the tone of what is black and what is British, essentially. And when you're having conversations with particular individuals, there's just things that they just don't know. There's differences and nuances that they're just unaware of. So it's for us as a community to organize. That's what they're very big on in America. They talk about organizing, right? To form coalitions, to form community and organizations that are able to move some of those barriers that we're seeing, and that's the only way that we make the change. It's really easy to kind of like point out what the problem is, and there's not more like solution based. So I definitely have seen people moving in that direction and making that change, but it's going to need more people.
We should end on that note. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and thank you to the three of you again. This conversation has been beyond my expectations. It's been sprawling, and I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to speak with all three of you.